another myth for us to bust. And this time it is gifted children come from middle and higher income families. You've got it. What's your response? And trust me, lots of people believe that. And while we're doing that, does anyone have any opportunities that are coming up that we need to share with the group? And you could put that in the chat. And Tyler, I don't think Jonathan's on yet. Is that correct?
That's correct. Oh, now he's here.
Oh, perfect. Perfect timing, Jonathan. We are delighted to have you here. We've talked about lots of different things this morning, and Dr. Jonathan Plucker from Johns Hopkins University. He's the Julian Stanley Endowed Professor, and I have a soft spot in my heart for Dr. Stanley. Someone may have heard me say this before, but somehow he became very interested in work as we were advocating for what has become the Gatton Academy. And he sent the first monetary gift that we had. He sent a check for $1,000. That was the very beginning of our Gatton Academy. And Jonathan does lots of things, but today he is here to share with us about a report that was issued in June of 2023. The title of the report looks like this. It's online. We've printed it off. Building a wider, more diverse pipeline of advanced learners. So, Jonathan, tell us a little bit about this report from the National Working Group on Advanced Education.
Thank you, Julia. It's nice to be here today. I hope the session's going well. And Julia, I have about a half an hour, correct?
That's correct.
Awesome. So I think I probably not a huge surprise to everyone, but I'd say over the last 15 to 20 years, we've just seen just this exponential growth in sort of high quality applied research on what helps gifted students. And several of us have been calling for 5 or 6 years now that it would be nice to have sort of a national group of experts come together, summarize all that we've learned, and sort of point out where we need to go next. And that's really what this report does. And Tyler, I'm assuming I can share my screen here. Share. Okay.
Looks great.
Looks great. Okay, thank you so much. So the Fordham Institute brought a bunch of us together. We met for, gosh, I'd say about a year and a half, a few virtual meetings, several face-to-face meetings. I'm going to show you the list of participants in 1 second. It was a very impressive group. I actually loved coming to these meetings because there wasn't a meeting where I didn't come away with lots of ideas and things that I had learned. So it was a lot of fun. And as I suspected, it wasn't that hard. It wasn't that hard for us to really find sort of really good lessons learned from this past 15 to 20 years. And the way that I've sort of described it to some of my friends and colleagues is 10 years ago, if a principal or parent came up to me and sort of asked, what do we know? What can we do? What don't we know? I would have talked a lot longer about what we don't know than what we actually know. And even things that we knew then, like acceleration is generally positive for most bright students. Just our depth of understanding of how to do acceleration correctly, why it seems to work so well, has just gotten so much deeper. And then we've just learned a ton of other things that I'm going to be walking through too. The National Working Group, this was the mission. Really, if I had to paraphrase this in one pithy sentence, it would be, how would I do it? I would say our goal was to answer the question, how do we design and implement effective, equitable, advanced education? And I think we kind of figured it out. So that's what I'm going to share with you today. These are the members. I'm not going to go through each person. There's probably a lot of familiar names to lots of people there. Academics, teachers, parents, people from all over the country, lots of geographic diversity, racial and ethnic diversity. Some people were from education, some from economics, a different sort of content area, specialties, math, science, humanities, etc. Public sector, private sector, and a lot of parents. Politically, all over the political map, from very conservative people to very, very progressive people, lots in the middle. And in this day and age, it was actually refreshing to sit down with people who you don't necessarily agree with on most things, and just sort of discover how much overlap there is when it comes to advanced education, working with bright students, gifted kids. We didn't have a ton of arguments, actually. It was more about educating each other, which again, made for a great experience. So these are the 3 overriding principles that we came up with from reading 50 years of research studies. And I'm going to get into a lot more specificity here soon. And I'm going to try to leave some time for questions, if that's okay, Julia and Tyler. But I think the first one is very important. Gifted education has kind of had a find the gifted child model, and you're going to see when I get to identification that the research really doesn't support that mindset. It's less about finding the gifted child and more about finding which students need more than what they're currently getting. It's a much more developmental approach. Number 2, you're going to hear me talking about a lot. The group, and this is something that I've believed for a long time, is really focused on the fact that, like in some school districts, they're doing lotteries now for kids to get into advanced learning opportunities. If you're doing lotteries, that means you're not offering enough services. That is the first thing that means. It doesn't mean that you're being equitable. It means that you are artificially limiting supply of advanced education. There is no reason for that. And so I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And then just making sure that you have those like support networks in place, which leads me to the first slide. Actually, we kind of start with that. I think I'm going through about 4 or 5 different areas that we touch in the report. The first, accessible front loading. And that the best way that I can illustrate this is with an example. It's kind of hard to describe. At least I struggle with it otherwise. Miami-Dade County, Florida is well known for its success with advanced placement courses and tests. It's a very, very equitable system. They have very small excellence gaps, those sort of achievement gaps on like the top end. And that's because they got a new superintendent, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago now. And he came in, and the first thing he did was he noticed that several of his high schools had never offered a single AP course. And he went to those principals and said, I want you to start offering advanced courses for students immediately. He got all the normal excuses. Oh, the students can't handle it. They're all too poor, you know, blah, blah, blah. What we hear all the time. And he goes, okay, that may be the case, but I want AP courses, honors courses in every high school next year. So they did that. And after a year or two, those advanced placement teachers said, you know, waiting till 10th, 11th grade is too late. Like we need to start earlier. So they went to the 9th and 10th grade teachers and got them to raise the level of rigor and challenge and support. A year or two later, what happened? Those teachers came back and said, we have to start in middle school. Like you can't start in 9th grade. A year or two later, the middle school teachers came back and said, why are we waiting to middle school? This has to start as soon as they get to school. And so then they eventually sort of reverse engineered the system where from the very beginning, they were providing more opportunity for students to do advanced work. It means that they had to support them differently. They really had to study that. Fast forward a decade later, what happens? All those students who have been supported and challenged all the way through didn't need special accommodations when they got to high school because they had had these great opportunities and support for them. So they got to advanced placement and they just started to crush it on these tests. So, you know, not waiting until the advanced opportunity is there. And I actually came across a great quote by President Lyndon Johnson in 1964. He was talking about the Civil Rights Act, and I just love how he phrased it. He was like, you know, if you've never encouraged people and helped them learn to run, why would you suddenly put them on the starting line and expect them to excel the first time out? Like we need to prepare people for opportunities. You can't just say, hey, they get to 11th grade, now they can be advanced. So having more of a pre-K-12 mindset, we thought was really, really, really important. And schools with a high percentage of low-income students, not surprisingly, tend to have the lowest percentages of they tend to offer advanced services much less than other types of schools. But we know those students are there. We know that those advanced students are there. We have to see them, notice them, and provide those early opportunities. So that's front loading. And I should also say, there's no reason why it has to happen in school either. Summer programs, Western Kentucky's summer programs are a fantastic example of this. They do a great job with that, essentially front loading in school, outside of school. We didn't think it mattered where it happened. Children just need opportunities. Identification, something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. Fortunately, I think a lot of these items are not controversial at all. It's worth noting 7-8 years ago, some of them would have been, but I do think that we're really starting to get the hang of some of these changes. The first one obviously being universal screening. If you're going to be screening all students, again, not to find the gifted student, but to find those who need more than they're currently getting, more challenge, more depth, etc. Why not look at every student? One thing that we've learned from school districts is that they'll say, well, that's just so expensive to go out, purchase a new test and administer it. But there are lots of districts now that are having a lot of success, essentially universally screening with data that they already have on hand. It's amazing in the No Child Left Behind era, 21 and change years later, we have so much more data on students. Use it. In fact, the entire state of North Carolina uses their state math assessment data to do something called automatic enrollment. So essentially, if you perform well in math, you're automatically placed in an advanced math course the following year. They're just using existing data to do that, and they have found that it's been transformative. They're finding just literally thousands of new students across that state who seem to really want advanced challenge in math, who never even had the possibility of getting it before. And they didn't go out and create new tests and measures. It was nothing fancy. They just used the data that they already had, which we think is important. The last part, using school-based norms. So we'll talk about this for a few minutes. This is still controversial. A few of my colleagues and I are finishing up a book on this topic. It's the idea of identifying the most talented students you have locally. And again, it goes, I just defined that so incredibly poorly. I just essentially reversed the title on you. Let me try again. It fits with moving from the identify the gifted child mindset to the identify students who need advanced services mindset. Second is much more inclusive. If you're using local norms, school-based norms, you aren't looking for students who score, say, at the 90th percentile nationally, or even across your school district sometimes. You're looking for the top 10% of students performing in your school. We've done studies finding that the most inclusive way to do it is to look for those students. But then any student who sort of meets a national cutoff too, all of them all of them almost certainly need advanced learning services, and they should be receiving them. And so it tends to really expand the pool of students that we see of as being talented. There's still quite a bit of pushback about using local norms because it's a different way of thinking about things, kind of, right? And so what I frequently hear from people is, oh, we could never use local norms. We would never use those with kids. And you know what? We use local norms all the time with children. We do it in sports, arts, extracurricular types of things, co-curricular types of things. Probably the best example I can share somewhat tongue-in-cheek is when your local high school football team, they have football tryouts. The coach doesn't sit there and go, okay, after the tryout, 6 of you meet the standard that we have. Like you are all county, all conference, all state players. But we're not going to use local norms. So we're only going to play with those 6 people this year. We're not going to play with anybody else. That's silly, right? It's like ridiculous. That's the mindset though. What your coach does, what your orchestra leader does, is they look for those who meet those impressive standards, but then they look at people who have the talent to get there, right? And they're going to look locally and they're going to fill as many spots as they can with those children. And then they're going to support them, teach them, and help them get to that high level. We think that's very consistent with how we think about schools in general, right? Like education is developmental. We're supposed to be helping people get into this, high achievement category. Again, sports, arts, we don't have a huge problem using local norms. Academics, especially advanced academics, some people really sort of hesitate with it. But here's another great example. National Merit Scholarship designations are based on state norms. Like there's not a national standard. Depending on the state that you live in, College Board has different cutoff scores. So they are using a local norms approach. Local norms, we think should at least be on the table when any school district is thinking about what they should be doing for advanced education. We think it's a huge opportunity generator, and that's certainly how the working group was talking about it. Another thing, and the working group talked about this. This is something that I've been working with lots of school districts on, so I just wanted to talk about it briefly. When I come back to school districts, which I've done a lot of this summer, to say, okay, of all the strategies that we talked about last year, which ones did you try and which ones seemed to work the best? This is actually the one, it's almost always the first thing that they mention to me. So I really want to make sure we talk about it. When we're trying to find students who, again, need that challenge, who aren't currently getting it, we often use teachers as sort of an initial screen. We have lots of studies over the past several years that say that that's problematic. And I'm not blaming teachers at all. Teachers receive almost no training in how to do that well. Teachers are not trained to be gatekeepers. I also think, as a former third grade teacher, I didn't want to be a third grade teacher to become a gatekeeper. Like that's not why I went into school. I went in there to help students, right? So I had no training to be a gatekeeper. I didn't have the mindset to be a gatekeeper. I don't know, but maybe a decade ago or so, I started stumbling across districts that were turning it around. And unlike some of my colleagues who say that you shouldn't be talking to teachers at all, teachers still know students really, really well. And I think this mindset of just taking them out of the identification process doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I think we use teachers incorrectly. And so what these districts started doing was they flipped it around. And the last people to give input during that process were students' teachers. And they essentially, in my mind at least, I think of it as they turned teachers from gatekeepers into safety nets, which makes a lot more sense to me. One, it fits the teacher mindset more, right? Like you're there to help as many kids as you can. And it gets around that training problem. So what you do instead is after you've done your universal screening and you have your pool of students, that's when you go to each teacher and say, okay, here's who we've identified among your students. Who are we missing? Like, who did we miss and why? And I sat in one school district, not terribly far from your state, and I actually could sit in on those meetings, and it was fascinating. Every single teacher had at least one student that they thought had been missed, and they gave really detailed reasons about why the student had been missed. A lot of recent immigrant students, lower income students, and in some cases it was whenever you screened, the student was sick or was having a really bad day, but like the teacher knew that, and they could also share examples of those students' strengths. We were really, really impressed by that. We generally suggested to everyone that we, that we work with now. Again, when we cycle back to districts, say, okay, what's working and what's not, this is almost always the first thing that they mention to us. So if you are an educator, I strongly suggest it. Getting more into programming now with an eye on the clock here, I got about 14 minutes. Acceleration still remains one of the, if not the most supported educational interventions in all of education. We know it works to let students move at their own pace. There aren't many good arguments against it, and we have just study after study after study. I think part of the problem is that people hear acceleration and they think we're automatically talking grade skipping. Maybe, but I believe there are 21 other forms of acceleration. And if you just Google Acceleration Institute, you get all of their fantastic reports out of the University of Iowa, just sort of detailing all these different ways to do this. I think acceleration also tends to be one of the more politically palatable forms of advanced education. in part because it's just kind of hard to argue against. And everything written here on this slide, just there are so many different, I mean, there's a huge volume of studies that support all of these things. So I think number 9 is probably the most important. I have another slide too. The next slide also has more acceleration recommendations, but it doesn't have to be all or nothing. You may have a student who's really talented and needs to be challenged more in almost every topic area. But you know what, like math or science or English is really where their passion lies. Then you can just accelerate in that one area. I think at this point, if I hear objections to acceleration, it's almost always logistical, as being, well, it's going to mess people's schedules up. That for me falls into the bucket of adult problems and not kid problems, right? Like acceleration solves that sort of bucket of children problems. Logistics isn't adult problems. We can figure those logistical problems out. Next slide on acceleration. Number 12 kind of flies in the face of what we see a lot of districts around the country doing, especially larger urban districts. Not so much in Kentucky, fortunately, but you are seeing places, especially on West Coast, East Coast, just stopping advanced courses in, say, elementary school, middle school. And whenever they do, they always have lots of excuses about why they do it. But when push comes to shove, they by the time students leave high school, all of their advanced education is kind of all their advanced achievement falls off a cliff. Of course, right? If you're not offering advanced services, where are students going to get it otherwise? For lots of students, public school is the only place. So we think that's a huge problem. Number 13, I've already talked about automatic enrollment a little bit. The research is still coming in, but it looks very promising. I say this as a parent who had a very bright middle school girl. We moved from one state to another. We moved from a very strong math state to an okay math state. And in the okay math state, they just couldn't believe that the previous state had good math education. And even though our daughter had great math test scores, they kept putting her in the they just under-challenged her in math. And every year we'd have to go in and argue again and say, she got straight A's last year in advanced math. Why do you keep placing her, below her challenge level? And every year we had to go back and fight. It should have been automatic. She excelled in advanced math. The next year, she should have been excelling in advanced math. And she did, but we had to fight every time. My family knew how to fight, and we knew that these things could be challenged. Lots of families don't have that sort of social educational capital. It's a huge inequity. And so automatic enrollment kind of smooths that out for lots of families and lots of children. And I think that's all. In the interest of time, I'm going to move along here. We think that ability grouping is one of those things that really has a bad sort of rap, especially among many educators. The research tells us differently, that if you're being very flexible, you're sort of consistently assessing students, it can be most helpful for students sort of in the bottom 25% and then at the top 25%. In the middle, it doesn't seem to make a huge difference either way, but for that, lowest achieving quarter and the highest achieving, it seems to help them learn the most every single year. So flexible ability grouping. I think flexible readiness grouping is a better way to think about it, because it's not about ability, it's about the student's sort of current readiness level. And that we know that we can increase. Selective enrollment schools. There was a wide range of opinions about these schools, whether they really worked all that well or not, whether they were sort of politically wise, big diversity of opinion here. But our major conclusion was, if you're going to have them, you can't have it be 200 students. I was just talking about a week and a half ago with a sort of medium-sized school district, about the size of lots of Kentucky districts. And they have a selective elementary school. And they have about, I don't know, 400 to 500 students who actually qualify, but they only opened up 200 seats, even though they have room for more. And so, of course, it's led to all sorts of political problems, equity problems. And what I keep saying to them is, why are you limiting the size of the school so much? If you have 400 to 500 qualified students, that tells you you need to be offering more advanced services. It doesn't need to be luck. Opportunity actually can be designed into the system. In some districts, they hear that immediately, and others they say, absolutely not. And there's almost always lawsuits. It's such an avoidable problem. So yeah, that always drives me crazy. And I think the other things there are pretty straightforward. I want to make sure I get through all the slides. What we generally tell school districts is grow the pie. If you're trying to change the way that you identify students, you're going to find a lot more of them. It is a very weak short-term strategy to just divide the pie up differently. A lot of families really have to fight to get those advanced services for their students. And for you to come along and say, hey, you got services last year, but this year we're rethinking how we do it. So you may not get services or the same quality of services this year. Of course, people are going to be upset. They should be upset. That's nonsensical. You should be expanding services. In part because we only have a handful of studies on this, but those that we have strongly suggest that if you offer advanced services, it's kind of like building highways. Every time you build a highway, people fill the highway with cars. You offer advanced services, students who have been eagerly seeking those opportunities tend to flood into those advanced services. And within 2 years, even those who didn't have very good front loading tend to catch up. And so growing more pie is certainly the solution. And this is actually my favorite grow the pie image. So this is what students do. They throw themselves into it, which we think is really important. Just a couple more slides here. Social and emotional learning and mental health supports. If you're going to be expanding opportunity, that means you're going to have a much more diverse base of students and children. That's a really good thing. And so it's very important to make sure that you're being culturally relevant whenever you can. This is something that some of my colleagues and I have been studying, I've personally been studying recently, especially in more small town and rural areas, sort of a place-based curriculum that really values the local culture, I think is incredibly important. I'm biased. That's kind of the community that I grew up in, a very small town, lots of cow farms, et cetera. We just think it's really important to be using local resources, examples, just to make the curriculum, make the services sort of as grounded and sort of contextual, interesting to the students that you have in front of us. I think it's also very consistent with that local norms approach too. It's going to sound like I'm contradicting my next slide, but I think 23 is really, really important. Research says bright students tend to be pretty psychologically hardy. But we have lots of students who deal with anxiety. We certainly deal with that in my family. So just making sure that those psychological supports are there to help students when they struggle. Maybe the struggles are related to them being frustrated and held back in school, but they're also just kids, right? And kids are kids, and they're going to have a variety of challenges, no matter how well they are doing. And so I think that's important. But at the same time, I think this is really, really important. And I spent a lot of time with this animation, so I'm going to show it to you. Ah, wasn't that awesome? It's like it's really snowing, which is ironic because I'm in Tennessee right now doing this. It's about 105 degrees outside. So children are not delicate snowflakes. One of the biggest barriers that especially principals share with me is, well, we could try this for this student or this group of students, but what if it doesn't work? I in no way am questioning the sincerity of that comment. I think they really are concerned about what if it doesn't work. And what I try to remind them again is that if it doesn't work, go back to what you were doing before or try something new. You're not harming the students. We're not performing surgery on them, right? Like let's try this new advanced opportunity. After a couple weeks, if it doesn't look like the students enjoying it and they want to go back to what they were doing before, have them go back. I can guarantee you 90% of those kids within a week are going to forget it even happened. The only people who are going to remember are the adults. This sort of, we just like can't try stuff with students because it could harm them. That's an adult mindset problem. It's actually not a kid problem for most of these children. So try stuff out, see if it works. And if you're a parent, I think it's really important to advocate for, hey, let's try it out. If it doesn't work, we tried. And then my kid can try something else. I think that's a much better mindset than this thing. I see it more and more of, like, what if it doesn't work? Who cares? Try it out. It's probably going to work. Okay, and then last slide, I believe. Sorry, moving in the wrong direction, getting excited. Well-prepared educators and high quality instructional materials. You can be doing all these other things well. And if you don't have teachers who know how to work with a high quality curriculum, high quality activities, then the rest of this stuff really doesn't matter. So it goes back to, what are we trying to identify students for? Students who need more challenge. What are we challenging them with? That's very, very important to this group. So I believe that is it. It is. I am right on time, and so I am glad I hit my mark. Anything you think I should follow up on quickly here on Julia? People can download the report. It's easy to find.
So what questions do you have for Jonathan? We have time to do questions. Anyone? And as you're posting questions, let me remind you that Jonathan will be at WKU to do an all-day workshop on this particular report on November the 30th. And it would seem to me that if you came with a team of people, it would be very important for you to take that information, do some planning on which of the recommendations you can tweak from what you're doing and put in place to have more students achieving at advanced levels. Okay, any questions posted? Tyler, do you see anything?
I don't see anything from the audience. I did put a question in. I don't know if Jonathan wants to add anything about local norms. I think that some of our districts are still struggling with that, how to implement and also how to communicate it. Are there any great resources that you think that folks should check out about local norms and implementation and communication?
If I get around to finishing this book, Tyler, yeah, I'm going to have some fantastic resources for everyone. Like, we're so close to finishing it, and it is just full of profiles of school districts, programs in school, after school, that are actually using local norms and just finding fantastic success with them. I think the important thing is, I think the big thing about communicating it is that it's just hard for people to understand at first because it's not how we've done this. But I do encourage people, again, to look at parallels of what you're already doing in your schools that utilize local norms. There are a lot more than people think. And just like pointing those out to people when they're like, wait, we've never identified gifted students this way before. But then you can say, yes, but we have identified talent this way before. And let's talk about how those things are similar or different. I would argue they are much more similar. And that if you take a more expansive view of what gifted education, talent development is, whatever you want to call it, advanced education is what I prefer. All these things matter, and they are very, very parallel. In terms of implementing, I think I think especially places like North Carolina with auto enrollment, like being very locally focused, expanding opportunities for students. When you talk about expanding opportunity, everyone is on board until you actually do it, right? And then people really, really struggle with it. And what they're finding is success is the best motivator and the best explainer. So after a year, they started getting all these students who were doing better in math, and they were starting to thrive. And now it's not that controversial. At the time, it was very, very controversial, even though I would argue it's kind of a common sense strategy. I wouldn't even say kind of. It's a common sense strategy. I should not, qualify it. But success becomes your best friend there. But like, if people want me to share examples and profiles, we published a few profiles of cool districts. My colleague Melanie Meyer wrote up 3 or 4 of them a couple of years ago. She was with us at Hopkins as a postdoc. She's now at Baylor. I'm happy to send those, or I can send them to you, Tyler, and you can post them and share. But people are doing it. It's working. That's what I think is really important.
Yes,
Absolutely.
please do share that. I would love to have those and be able to share them with folks.
And Melanie was here for the Cage Fall Conference a year ago. So some of the people here would be acquainted with Melanie Meyer. Well, Jonathan, thank you ever so much for joining us on a Saturday morning. We'll look forward to having you here in late November. Thank you.
I look forward to it. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Enjoy.
you.